Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. I hope you guys are all having a wonderful Monday and a happy new year. It's hard to believe that we're in 2022 already, but I thought we'd start the new year off right with something interesting, a little bit of a history of the Crested Gecko market and pricing over the last 5 years. I thought this is something that would be pretty interesting for a video just because I'm always saying, Crested Geckos are getting more expensive. It seems like they're getting more expensive. If you've watched any of my videos, you've probably heard me say that 1,000 times. So today I wanted to show you some interesting data and actually prove to you that they are in fact getting more expensive. So the website that I used for all this data was obviously MorphMarket. They have the best kept records of all the geckos that were sold 5 years ago. But there is a couple things you should keep in mind about MorphMarket as I share with you this data. Number one being that MorphMarket for Crested Geckos was pretty new back in 2017. Not all breeders had adopted it yet, so maybe some of the more expensive breeders weren't on it yet. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that MorphMarket has kind of a selling glitch where if I say put a gecko up for $500 and 3 people message me about it but none of them buy it, and then I delete the ad, MorphMarket will still say, hey, a bunch of people messaged them, it must be sold, and so they'll automatically mark it sold, and unless you go back in and change it, it'll always stay that way. Another thing about MorphMarket is it doesn't allow any room for negotiation. If I have a gecko for $500 and Joe Blow says, hey, will you take $450? And I say, yeah, and I mark it as sold, it'll still stay at $500 unless I go back in and change it, which I'm just assuming a lot of people don't. And obviously, as you get more expensive geckos, $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, the chances of negotiation obviously goes up. So it's always possible that these prices are a little bit off, but it's not off enough to where it completely ruins the data in any way, but that's just something to keep in mind. Now I'm going to be doing this by year, but something to note is that I'm only doing 2017 and 2018 and then skipping the 2021 just because there's been so many Crested Geckos sold on MorphMarket. I couldn't possibly go through them all. I think there's like over 20,000 total, so that would be a lot of data points to go through, but I think you'll get a good enough idea from the data I'm going to show you. And I was only counting geckos that were sold in like 2017, 2018. If a gecko was posted in another year and sold in another year, like let's say a gecko was posted in December of 2016 and then finally sold in January of 2017, I did not count it. I was only counting animals that were sold, posted, and sold in the same year. But with all that being said, let's finally jump into some of the data. As we cover the data, I'm going to have it up on screen too, so it's hopefully a little bit easier to understand because I'm going to be throwing out some numbers here and I don't want it to get too confusing. But initially, going into this, I expected that adult female Crested Geckos would probably have the biggest increase and cost the most. So I figured we'd start off there. So in 2017, there was 62 females sold for an average of $281. Seems pretty fair. 2018, there was 83 females sold for $361. So that's a pretty big jump for females, adult females, $80 increase in 1 year. That's pretty dang good. Now fast forward to 2021, I sampled 115 females just because there was way too many to get all the data points in. So that's going to be my max. If there was too many geckos sold in the year for a certain category, I stopped at 115 because I felt like that was enough data points to make a good average on. So in 2021, the average price of a female Crested Gecko was $570, or in other words, adult female Crested Geckos have had a 200% increase in 5 years, which is basically saying that they doubled in price over the last 5 years, which is pretty crazy. Now, one thing to consider about that 2021 price is I was not factoring in any sort of actual morphs, no lily whites, no axanthics, no het axanthics, nothing like that. And if I were to factor those in, it would be 121 females and the price would be $678 average. The reason I didn't factor them in the beginning is because back in 2017 and 2018 those weren't common at all, so it really wouldn't be fair if I factored those in to begin with. So that's pretty crazy though. 2021, the average price of an adult female Crested Gecko sold was $570. That's getting pretty expensive compared to 2017 and a 200% increase. That's pretty good. Moving on, let's move on to some adult males. In 2017, there was 76 adult males sold for an average price of $218. Pretty good, pretty fair. 2018, there was 87 males sold for an average price of $248. There was also 1 lily white sold, and if you factor that guy in, then it brings the average up to $280. So, not that big of an increase in those years. It was $80 for the females in those years, and then the males, it was only $30, so less than half. That's pretty good, although to be expected because males are less desirable. Now, fast forward to 2021 males, Again, I hit the max at 115. The average price was $385. So that's a 176% increase in 5 years. So a little bit less than double, about 25% less than the adult females, but still getting up there pretty expensive. So to buy an adult breeding pair in 2021 would have costed you about $900 versus about roughly $500 back in 2017. So things are getting pretty expensive, as you can tell. I was very surprised when I did this data to find that they had jumped by that much. And now the biggest surprise to me, in fact, was juvenile crested geckos. So there was a lot of juveniles sold in 2017. So again, I hit the max at 115, and the average price was $95. That seems about right. You know what I would expect to pay for an average juvenile back then. In 2018, again, I hit the max, 115. The average price was $135. So that's a $40 increase in 1 year. And actually, that's a little bit more than the adult males in the same year, which I think is very interesting. I was not expecting that. Now, fast forward to 2021. Again, I hit the max at 115, but the average price was $236 for a juvenile crested gecko in 2021, which is crazy because that's a 248% increase over 5 years. That's even more than the adult females, way more than the adult males. So juvenile crested geckos have actually had the most increase in the last 5 years, which is very surprising. I was not expecting that. I was expecting it to be the adult females for sure. Now, if you factor in the 15 or so lily whites, axanthics, and charcoals that were also included in the 2021 juveniles, bringing it up to 130, the average price would then be $408, which is more than the adult males by themselves. So that's pretty expensive. That's pretty crazy. It's hard to believe that a juvenile crested gecko is getting pretty close to the same price as an adult male. Now you might say, Sam, well, that's a lot of data. You know, that's pretty crazy. Obviously, geckos are getting more expensive. And I would say you're right. But you might be saying, well, why are they getting more expensive? And I came up with a couple things. Number one being just supply and demand. I think crested geckos really took off in 2020 with the pandemic. I think a lot of people were home. They wanted pets. They said, hey, let's go online. They discovered crested geckos. And so I think there was a lot of people that really got into crested geckos in probably the last year or two. And just, I think the supply can't keep up with it. And, you know, people want lizards, and so they get more and more expensive. But I also think that just in general, as a whole, the crested gecko market and the pet market in general is just getting more popular every day. And so that's making these animals more expensive. Another thing to consider outside in the real world is, you know, inflation is pretty high right now. Unless you've been living under a rock, you know that pretty much everything else is more expensive too. I mean, the plastic tubs that I put my crested geckos in are up 30% at Walmart. So, you know, that's not too far off of what our crested gecko prices are increasing. But I mean, used cars and groceries and literally everything else is more expensive. So it only makes sense that crested geckos are also more expensive. That's just within the last year or two where it's really taken off and things have gotten more expensive. But nonetheless, I'm sure that's a contributing factor as to why crested geckos are getting more expensive. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking that this is kind of like a bubble and that it might pop and there's eventually going to be cheaper crested geckos again. And while that could happen, I would say, in my opinion, that's very unlikely. There's a video produced by Altitude Exotics about a little bit more than a year ago, and he was explaining his history of the crested gecko market and him personally, how he's sold crested geckos and what prices he sold them at and when. And I believe he was going all the way back until about 2010. So I definitely recommend watching that video. It's a great video. But if you watch that video, you'll notice that even from back then till now, crested gecko prices have been increasing for the last 10 years. So I find it hard to believe that we're going to eventually get cheaper crested geckos again. I think from here on out, they're going to only get more expensive, especially nice crested geckos. I think the nice and high-end crested geckos are going to continually to get even more expensive as time goes on. And I also feel like the average gecko is going to get more expensive too. Not by as much as the nice ones, but they're still going to slowly increase over time until they're just, you know, more and more expensive. So if there's anything to take away from this video, it's number one, that yes, crested geckos are in fact getting more expensive and I am not a crazy person. But also number two is that these geckos are going to continually to get more expensive. So if you're thinking about waiting to buy a gecko, maybe because of price, a gecko you really want, like I don't know, some crazy morph or something, it's unlikely that you're going to see it anytime soon come down in price, any significant amount anyway, unless you're looking at some of the specific morphs like lily whites, which are in fact doing the opposite of the regular crested gecko, and they are getting cheaper over time because it's a codominant mutation. And so like lily whites will continue to get cheaper and cheaper, but the average crested gecko, the normal crested gecko, is going to continue to get more expensive. So that's something to keep in mind when purchasing your animals, is that so far anyway, these animals are continuing to get more and more expensive by the day, by the year. So just buy your gecko, buy whatever you want. With that being said, hopefully this video was somewhat interesting to you. I thought it was very interesting and eye-opening. I was not expecting the animals to increase by this much. I mean, I could tell that they were getting more expensive over time, but I didn't realize that some of them were doubling or more in the last 5 years. So that's pretty crazy. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like on it. And if you have anything interesting to comment on this, please leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think about increasing crested gecko prices. And with that being said, I hope to see you in my next video.